to episode 7. I'm Tomas.
I'm Thomas.
And this is TechBus. Hey guys, welcome back. We're excited, episode 7. We brought another guest, Arthur Doler. I'll let him kind of introduce himself and let you know what he does and kind of what we're going to be talking about.
I'm Arthur Doler, or Art, either one. I've been a software engineer for, 12 years now, and recently I've been getting into a lot of things about psychology of motivation, feedback, almost more things about work and around work than the actual work itself. And how we can take that and use it both at work and in our software.
Awesome. When we get back, we'll jump right into the conversation. Thanks for joining us again. We'll see you soon.
Welcome back. First thing we're going to talk about is the psychology of motivation, and I know, Arthur, you've been going around giving some talks about this at different places.
Yeah.
Where have you been giving the talks to me first off?
I gave this talk at Nebraska Code in Lincoln, and then at KCDC in Kansas City. Okay. And I'll be giving it at DevUp in St. Louis as well.
Okay, so. Great. So yeah, let's just start the conversation. So the psychology of motivation, how has it been, looked at in the past versus now is one of the things to look at, and just general.
Okay, so historically, motivation has been looked at as it's been in a couple different models. The first model that came around is a model that they looked at called drive theory, where drive theory is this thing that was proposed by Freud and Adler and psychologists back at the dawn of psychology, and even before that, people like Pavlov, etc. And drive theory says that you have these drives, that you have drives to eat, you have drives to sleep, you've got all of these needs that you have to essentially fulfill. And you can get more complex with it, like you have these drives to, be accepted, and that drive leads to behavior like to be nice to other people. And you have a drive to, get money to fuel those other things, right? Yeah. So those drives funnel your behavior. That was kind of the initial motivation, and that's what a lot of really animal drive or animal motivation works like that in a lot of ways. If you put an animal in a situation, it's going to act to fulfill its drives, absent anything else. Around about the time humans started civilization, we decided that wasn't going to cut it. And we kind of invented this second way of thinking about motivation, which was to start thinking of it in terms of what everybody thinks of it now, which is punishments and rewards, right? Those are the two big things that we think about as far as motivation. Like if I want you to do something or want you to not do something, I apply, positive stimulus. And the interesting thing about that is it worked for a really long time. And it works pretty well. Most of the time.
When you say a really long time, what
centuries. We're talking like from 15,000 BC to roughly sometime around the Industrial Revolution. Wow. Most of the time. It has its drawbacks, but by and large, that'll get people to do what you want most of the time. In the sense that if you apply enough of a reward, they will generally do the thing you want. Or if you apply enough of a punishment, they will typically not do that thing. Although, as evidenced by the fact that we still have crime, even though we have laws preventing that, that doesn't always work, right? Mm-hmm. There are still edge cases in that system, and so we have these systems built up around the edge cases to still kind of capture those things.
Right.
But if you think about it, what's happened since computers started to happen, really, is all of these jobs that were originally based on thinking about things or doing things in what they call algorithmic tasks, which you guys are software, you know algorithms. They're things you can follow through, and they have a series of steps that you're executing, and you follow through and you just execute the steps and you get a guaranteed result at the end, right?
Okay.
So if you're, for instance, on an assembly line, picking up one piece, cleaning it off and moving it to a different location on the assembly line, and you do that the entire day, that's algorithmic, because you're just doing one thing and moving it from one place to the other. when you start to get to the point where robots are doing that, or those things are being taken care of, and jobs start to become more creative, around about 1960, like the Industrial Revolution era, to like the 1960 era, they started, you start encountering these thinkers like Deming, W. Edwards Deming, who's an amazing guy. If you haven't read his books, he did a lot of work on quality and how to measure, like how to get quality and how to take measurements and stuff like that. Frederick Herzberg, who was a psychologist who did a lot of work in that kind of vein as well. And these guys started thinking, oh, well, this isn't really going to cut it. So they started coming up with things that patch the system a little bit. And you wind up with things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you haven't heard of it. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid. And at the bottom it says, okay, you need these things for survival. You need water, food, air. Above that, you need security, safety. You need those things. Above that, you start needing things like enjoyment, pleasure. Above that, you start needing things like like the top of the pyramid is self-actualization for Maslow. It's kind of this period, you're moving above and beyond where, beyond just the lower level stuff. The thing about the pyramid though is if you don't provide those lower levels, you won't even think about the higher levels. So they start looking at jobs in this manner. Like if your job doesn't pay enough or you don't have job security, you're not even going to worry about whether you're engaged in the job. And so that's kind of been the modern take on a lot of jobs. It's just kind of still the punishments and rewards with this little bit of like, oh, maybe they're actual humans in it. But the thing is the easiest way to do it is to talk about experiments that Edward Deci did. And Deci was a psychologist that he took this thing, it's called a soma cube, it's a puzzle that they put out in the 70s. It's red, it's plastic, it's like that big. And it disassembles into pieces. And it's like 10 grams, you can just assemble it into different configurations and make it look like different things. Or reassemble it back into a cube. And he set up an experiment where he got two groups of people, and he said to the first one, okay, you guys he didn't tell them they were the control group, but they were the control group. And he said, all right, we're gonna let you do 3 configurations. All right? And that's it, you don't get paid, we're gonna track how long it takes you. Great. For the other group, he had them solve 1 configuration. Midway through, he's like, oh, actually, we have some money for this. So you're gonna get paid for, this solving how many configurations. So, and then the third day what happened is he came back and he said, oh, actually the money ran out. So now we're not gonna pay you anymore. So the first day they weren't paid, the second day they were paid, and the third day they weren't paid again. As opposed to, again, the control group, which is not paid all the way through. And he tracked how long it took them. But he did it sneakily because scientists are sneaky. He turned around and he said, okay, after they'd solved 2 configurations, he left the room. He's like, I have to go put in your times into the computer, and the computer will tell me which configuration you have to solve next. This was the 1960s. Computers were the size of another room, so he had to get up and go to the computer. Right. But he wasn't going to the computer. He just went around to the one-way window, the one-way mirror, and watched and said, hey, what are you guys doing? Now, in this room, there are magazines, there's stuff to do. I mean, it's the 1960s, so there's Playboy among the magazines. And he said, hey, how long do they actually spend playing with the puzzle when I'm not in the room? Like, what is their intrinsic motivation? And when he says intrinsic, what he means is, what is the motivation that they have that is internal to the task? And that differs from extrinsic motivation. So when we talk about punishments and rewards, those are extrinsic motivators, as opposed to intrinsic motivators. So an extrinsic motivator for if you want your child to take out the trash. An extrinsic motivator is, I'll pay you $5, please go take out the trash. An intrinsic motivator is if you can somehow instill in your child a feeling of joy at a job well done and delight in the fact that the house doesn't smell like trash anymore. Right. It's probably really hard if they're 15, but that's the kind of the goal.
Right.
But don't they quickly find out like that happens when they get paid as well? So
that's the thing.
It's like, yeah, the house smells nice, the trash is out. There's a motivator to that, but I get that high too.
That's where Deci comes in, though. Okay. So Deci watched these people and timed how long they spent playing with the puzzle. And if you look at the stats, what happens is the control group spends like roughly 9 minutes playing with it the first day, a little bit more the second day, and a little bit more the third day. They're just kind of slowly getting into it. The group that he paid, first they start off, and they're about what the control group is, within statistic, average fluctuation. The second day, as you'd expect, you applied an extrinsic motivator. They play with the puzzle a lot longer because they know they're going to get money if they can solve more configurations. When that money goes away, their time spent playing with the puzzle drops drastically. So,
Like lower than the first day.
yeah, way lower than the first day.
Okay.
So what happens is, and this has been replicated in a lot of studies, there are, I could cite 2 others off the top of my head. I don't know how much time we have, but
Maybe this is a good time to come back.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that. We'll come right back and we'll talk about some of those
The end of the
motivators.
study, yeah.
yeah, no sweat.
Awesome.
Thanks.
We took a little break, but I'm interested to see what happened at the end of that study.
Yeah,
Go
so-
ahead and continue.
Another study would be one Samuel Glucksberg did in '74, I think it was '74. And Glucksberg was a big fan of this study called the functional fixedness test. And what it is you come into a room and there is a table, and on the table's next to a wall. And on the table is a candle, a book of matches, and a box full of tacks. And your job is to light the candle and not get wax on the table. So it's kind of a mind puzzler thing. And you
Okay,
can,
Tom, got you. Go ahead. You have 5 minutes, figure it out.
Explain the problem again.
so you've got a box of tacks on a table
Okay.
with a candle and a book of matches, and it's next to a wall. And your goal is to light the candle and not get wax anywhere on the table.
And let it burn all the way down?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we have some tags and some
Can you put the candle in the box?
There you go. That is actually the solution. You dump the tacks out of the box and then put the candle in the box and tack the box to the wall.
Okay.
Thumbs up. And it's called a functional fixedness test because if you encounter it in a physical environment, your brain kind of fixates on the box as a container for the tacks because that's what you encounter them as. So you fix on that function,
Okay.
right? So you have to overcome that. You have to be creative and literally think outside the box. So he set up the study roughly the same way that Deci did. There was a group that he was timing that they'd be paid. And this was, no, it was the 60s, excuse me, because he had actually, it was like $20 for the person who made it fastest, and then $5 for everybody else in the top 25%. And the other group got nothing. He timed them because they're the control group. It took them like 9 minutes longer, the people who were being paid. And what
Okay.
Yeah, why is that?
it's because, well, it's a study, so it doesn't prove anything. But the theory is, the motivational theory behind it that Glucksberg expounded upon was that what happens is rewards like that make you myopic. You focus so much on wanting the reward and not wanting to lose the reward that you literally can't think as broad as you need to for some problems.
Okay.
And like the Deci study, thinking about these rewards can damage your intrinsic motivation to want to do those things. So it's this context in which creative problems, heuristic tasks as opposed to algorithmic tasks, where heuristic tasks are ones that are creative, they don't have a rote solution, you have to think about them, you have to encounter them, and they can evolve over time. Those things, which that's what a lot of programming is. And honestly, as computers take over more and more stuff, that's what most office jobs are anymore. You have to deal with people and stuff. It's not just people filing papers. It's people trying to solve problems and engage things and deal with other problems and things that the computers can't do.
So I'm a very pragmatic thinker about things. I like theory, but also pragmatism. So those things make sense, like on a very small scale. Like if you put me in a room and the monetary value of doing the task probably isn't very high, and I'm only in there for a few hours, like that sort of stuff makes sense. But how does that scale out to over 2 years? Like, are you having to constantly find stimulus for that person? Doesn't the reward motivator last longer over the long term?
Actually, no, because you'll acclimate to rewards over time.
Okay.
Because you'll see the same, like if you continue to give your child $5 every time they take out the garbage, eventually they'll be like, $5. Why don't you make it 10? And I mean, that's human beings acclimate to the new state of things pretty easily.
So how do businesses constantly innovate to find ways to make their employees, feel like they're being challenged? Is that the bottom line?
You let your employees challenge themselves is the way it works.
Okay.
What you do is you set up an environment, and this is what places like Google do well, Amazon does it well. Valve is really good at it because they don't have any structure, right? Companies that do this kind of thing, that hire for the people who have these intrinsic drives to do the job, they structure things so that you have autonomy. The three principles are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And autonomy is pretty self-explanatory. You try to give the person as much autonomy as you can over what they actually do. Within, reason. You've got, money coming in the door. The other is mastery. You try to give them avenues to get their own mastery, to let them challenge themselves, let them push themselves, because they will push themselves further. And then the last one is purpose. If you can tie what you're doing to something outside them, or to connect them to a larger world, both on the project they're working on, and as the company as a whole, what are you doing? What is your company's story? That kind of stuff. That is really cool because that will help. It's the glue that holds the autonomy and the mastery together, kind of.
Is that practical? I know that's practical in the sense of, let's say, a programmer, but what if you're a manager of a customer service and your main goal is to have these people answer 100 calls an hour, and you come in every day and you have to answer those calls via those scripts. Mm-hmm. How does a manager with that type of has to drive those people and those? How does he could overcome that?
You can make it easier by allowing the people some autonomy. If you can allow them to deviate from the scripts in places where they know they can help somebody, or they know what this person needs, but that's not in the script. Allow them autonomy to actually do that. Allow them the autonomy to say, hey, I know this is, it's not in the script. It's below a certain dollar amount to just refund you your money. It'll make you happy. It'll make me feel like I have helped you. Let them do it. Like that kind of concept. And again, it depends on how much, if you don't want to allow people to, refund thousands of dollars right off the bat, but
right.
If you're trusting these people that you're actually hiring, which is really important in this process, you have to actually trust them to do the job. And you should trust them, you hired them. So allowing them that kind of autonomy and then giving them that purpose where their purpose is now, rather than their purpose being get through 100 phone calls in a day, your purpose is help 100 people. That's a really different feeling for a person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
No.
So,
is there other practical ways, like I'm thinking smaller size businesses can implement this type of strategies? Because it's easy to cite someone like Google or Amazon who have, say
right.
unlimited cash and, they can kind of run these experiments on their employees or whatever. But
yeah.
What about your average, small mom and pop business? Are there things they can do? I think you mentioned a lot of the phone calls, but
yeah.
Does it scale, do you think?
I think it does. And I think your employees will employees at these smaller locations will accept that you're not Google. You can't cater all 3 meals a day, right? But in a lot of cases, I think they will accept that you are making the effort in places where you can. From even there are things like foosball tables and stuff like that. Culture that you're setting up is one thing, but then actually letting people go play with those. Because I've seen companies where they have the foosball table and there's nobody at it.
Right. Because
they know that if they go play it, they're going to actually get in trouble.
Right.
And
absolutely.
That's not fun.
Is that kind of the same thing with unlimited vacation, where you have unlimited vacation, but you're too scared to take it?
Those are psychological traps that they set up, and it looks from a perspective of I'm head of HR. Oh yeah, we give you unlimited vacation, and then everybody's like, yeah, but you're tracking how much I'm taking. Right? It's a psychological trap.
I always want to get one of those jobs and be like, all right, I'll see you in 5 years.
Well, and yeah, if you push the boundary, you find that it's probably not unlimited, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So but you can do things with, hey, maybe set aside some time to let your company, let your employees do like Google time or something like that, even if they're not,
Yeah.
or if you can't do 20%, do 10, do 5, give them whatever you can.
I think that's a great idea because that brings a lot of innovation, I think, to a company where if you allow them to have at least some percentage of the time where they can work on something and say, hey, the theme has to be, this is something you think that is going to benefit the company, or be, something good for the overall, direction of the business. But it's kind of hands-free, do what you want, and allow them to innovate. And I think that companies really, stifle themselves by not allowing them, because you have all these people on staff that are probably brilliant, have lots of ideas, and I think that's a great way to leverage it.
And putting in systems like that makes it so that you have a psychologically safe environment that lets people come forward and say, who normally wouldn't. If they feel safe in that environment, they feel like they can come forward and say, hey, maybe I had this idea. Maybe it fails, maybe it doesn't. We'll see what happens. And it blows me away because, Post-it notes are a great example because those were invented from 3M. 3M had 15% time they had, but they had Google time before Google was even a glimmer in anybody's eye back in the 40s. And it blows me away that, how long that, 3M has existed for that long and had those kind of policies, and it took forever for any of that stuff to catch on.
I love this quote that's going around on LinkedIn, and I know I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like this manager asking the owner of the company, what if we train these people and let them be creative, and then they leave the company, and then the owner turns to him and he says, what if we don't and they stay?
Yeah, that's
And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a cultural shift. I think it's the change though is slow, and it's I know, like take example West Telemarketing, which has changed to Alorica. I know when I was speaking with them as a recruiter, their whole mantra was that they were going to come in and change the environment, because I think them and like other companies like Cytel are realizing now that cycling through employees because of either the job or the policies is probably costing them a lot more than it would be to adopt these new.
Yeah, how many ideas are walking out the door every time somebody quits that could be improving?
Well, I wonder if we've hit a threshold, because back in the day, like my grandfather, he worked for IBM, and he worked there like his entire life to the company. And now we're to a point where people, like if you say 2 years at a job, that's considered a long time.
Yeah, I know.
So, have we reached the point where like that is actually more costly to have just you think about the uptime to train somebody, to get them, acclimated to what you're trying to accomplish, and
and I think
treat them like a commodity, I think.
Yeah, you have to set up a system which encourages them to stay. You have to set up something where you're rewarding them commensurately enough. You have to reward them enough that the money's off the table, is basically the way that works, because you want that reward. You unfortunately have to pay them. Like, that's the way the world works.
But I think it could actually be a good thing for small businesses that maybe don't have these huge astronomical budgets. Like, this is a way to keep employees engaged, and actually want to come to work and be productive, even though they can't necessarily afford to pay them a huge salary. It's a way to motivate them.
Well, it doesn't have to be huge.
Yeah.
It just has to be enough that they're not thinking about the money.
All right, guys, welcome back. We were actually, while we were on break, we were kind of talking a little bit about a couple different things like work environment and, setting expectations, and I don't know, maybe we could pick up that conversation a little bit for the viewers.
So, we were talking a little bit about setting expectations. I don't know if you want to mention where it was. I don't know how comfortable you are.
We can just keep it general.
Okay, so the context that originally came up was in discussing how some companies, especially ones that are based out of places like Mountain View or and other places that become big, treat their developers in one specific way, and then they don't treat the rest of their employees with that same kind of respect. Like even places that aren't necessarily good at, aren't are good at that, purpose, autonomy, mastery thing, don't necessarily extend that to the entirety of their workforce, which I always find weird.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's, especially if you start dealing with people where it's, I'm going to be honest, where they're often minorities or often people who are lower class, you get people that start treating them differently and will do things like, okay, well, you have to leave your cell phone in a box when you come to work because we can't be sure that you're not texting people or, taking photos. Like, if you work in a secure classified facility, that's one thing. But if it's just like, I can't be sure that all of my employees aren't texting things or taking sneaky photos of whiteboards and stuff and sending that off to my competitor. We probably need to do a better job of hiring or background checks or, in some way incentivize these people to not do that. And I don't mean that in the sense of like pay them money to not send photos, but the context is if you start treating people like in a specific way, if you treat people like criminals, it's interesting the way that they will start to fulfill that. They will start to act in ways that fulfill that.
Are you familiar with like the broken window theory?
Yeah, and it's similar.
That kind of
Explain that.
Yeah.
So it's a theory, and I think there's kind of a lot of evidence behind it. Is that if you have a neighborhood and somebody breaks like a window in a warehouse or something, like you need to fix that window right away, because if you don't, then the next guy that comes by, he sees that broken window, and then he starts treating the next window, he breaks it with a bottle or something, and then the next guy starts spray painting the wall, and it's like all started with that broken window, but then it just became the norm for the neighborhood. And they even talk about that with source code, like broken window theory with source code, like, hey, I'm gonna check this in, it isn't quite right, the code's a little messy, but it's Friday, I'm just gonna check it in anyway. And it's like just that one little bad code you checked in may not seem like a big deal, but then like you hire the next developer and he looks at that and he's like, oh, they don't really have standards here, so I'm just gonna take shortcuts.
Yeah.
And it starts with something small, like a broken window, and that applies to neighborhoods, to code, to business, all aspects of life.
It's really similar because it's very much you are setting an expectation for this interaction. Like, if we're interacting on if I showed up here and I was dressed in a suit and tie, we would be having a different conversation. Not...
We were kind of surprised you didn't show up in a tuxedo. But
And a top hat, and a monocle.
that's the usual attire, but...
I showed up in my Burger Lords t-shirt this time.
We usually dress up like in the Dumb and Dumber, the blue and orange tux.
But, you get what I'm saying. Like, those kind of things, setting up situations like that, I feel like I'm higher than you, I feel like I'm better than you, and that can inculcate resentment, inculcate those feelings in those other person that they wouldn't normally have before. Like, if you're not treating them like they're part of the team, they're not going to feel like they're part of the teams.
How do you convince businesses of that, though? Like, I've worked at companies where there was like a second class of employee. And, the IT department were obviously higher paid, treated differently. They literally were, somewhat segregated. But like, how do you convince companies that that's a bad idea?
It's hard. And partially because a lot of these companies are still on that motivation, like that old motivation theme that they're thinking about. They're thinking about, well, I can trust my developers because my developers, I know they're educated and they're this, like they think this way, and I know they're on board with what I'm trying to do. I can't trust these other people because I have to do the carrot and stick with them. And let me give you an example. Imagine for a second you work at a insurance company or, answering phones, helping people. And you have a coworker. Like, you guys are great, right? You're answering phones quickly, you're helping people, you're getting people to, meeting all of the things you need to do. Everybody loves you, you get great reviews, that kind of stuff. Your coworker just flat out sucks, right? They do the bare minimum that they can, and sometimes not even that, and they're just mailing it in and not helping people. And the typical corporate response to that is to institute a policy, a quota. Something like, oh, you have to get through this many calls a day,
right,
or you have to do this within an hour, or you have to do this within a certain period of time, or you have to meet this minimum standard. And the weird and interesting thing that happens when you do that is that, imagine for instance that your employee productivity is a, or not productivity, but performance is a normal curve, which, you guys know what logarithmic curves are, right? Like the J-looking ones, right? It's kind of like that. It's on a long tail. You have a lot of people that are kind of at the bottom end to the middle end, and then your top performers are worth way more than the other people. What happens if you start instituting a quota at that bare minimum? Think somewhere just to the, like, you have to make it so all people can meet it. So like all the people you're hiring can meet it. So you put it somewhere in the bulk of that, exponential curve. What happens is all of your top performers are looking at that and going, why am I sinking in the extra effort? All I have to do is this. And they're not even really necessarily thinking it consciously, but they start making decisions based on that. Like, oh, I know that this will take another 8 hours. If I could do this and I could help this person, but it's going to take me another 8 hours to get it done. I've done enough. We're good. And what it happens over time is your group will normalize around that quota, around that standard that you've set, despite the fact that you could have a bunch of people performing better than that beforehand.
So what's the alternative?
Well, the first one is to maybe the punish is the right word. Treat individual problems as individuals. Don't treat individual problems with a quota or with a group policy. And a lot of people like to do that because it avoids conflict, right? I don't have to address the singular problem or the smaller group of problems in the larger group of people if I can just go, oh, now this is the policy and everybody has to follow it. I can just do that, and as a manager, I don't have to ever talk to anybody. And it's I don't want to say it's the coward's way out, but it's definitely the easy way out. And it's totally what I would have done before starting to research into this stuff, because you think about it, it's like, okay, well, we just need a standard. Now everybody can just follow the standard. Well, yeah, now everybody's going to follow the standard from both sides. So again, it's that kind of giving those people the autonomy, especially when you start giving them quotas and stuff like that, because then over time, those just build up, right? You've got this to meet, you have this thing to meet, you've got this, you have to do this certain amount of effort. Over time, your job just becomes a bunch of those things, and then you wind up working in a government job.
I think I've been doing software long enough to know that, a lot of executives and people making decisions, they like dashboards with numbers and to see, like what things are at. Like, I think there has to kind of be like a mind shift, because they want to try and quantify things, and it's hard to do that without having quotas and numbers and things like that. Is that another thing you have to kind of overcome? Is like,
I think you can quantify it, you just have to quantify the right things.
Okay.
So take the case of if you're a call center or something like that. Quantifying call time, not the greatest thing, right? That effectively, call time means nothing except dollars, more or less. What the actual output of that call center you want is problem solved. Problem solved effectively so that the customer is happy.
but I'm saying those things are harder to quantify.
Oh yeah, no,
And I
you are
think-
straight up correct.
I think that's why it sometimes falls through the cracks, is because people are more concerned with quantifying things than necessarily like the true outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's...
Well, and you see that
something to
you see that in software a lot too. People that look at code coverage in unit tests as a affirmative metric as opposed to just a guideline or a bench post. Like people who say, oh, well, now everybody has to make 90% code coverage. And you're like, great, now I have to go test the 30 getters and setters in this class. Thumbs up. Like, that's not useful, right? But you've set a policy and now I have to waste time doing it.
Okay.
And on the other hand, what you're looking for is value to the customer, right? That's what we actually want out of it. That's what, we're theoretically shipping is value to the customer. So creating those situations and allowing those situations to exist where I can give the value without somebody coming down and setting a quota and setting these restrictive structures is a concept that's applicable to any level of job that is, again, not a straight algorithmic task. And above and beyond that, even if you're working something that looks like it's algorithmic, like take for instance, cleaning the floors, doing custodial services, that's actually not really that algorithmic, like it contains these algorithmic tasks inside of it, but knowing things like, oh, I know that I need to clean this floor on Fridays because there's a board meeting on Saturdays on this part of the day, like, and I want that floor to be nice and shiny. That's not something that somebody's going to think about if they're being treated like crap. Like, they're not going to care enough to bring in that kind of extra thing. There was a study, and I don't remember it.
I was going to say real quick, I kind of wonder if we see that even in like, you know, manufacturing and architecture. Like, you go to a downtown building and you can tell what building was built in the 20s and what building was built in the, past 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like older stuff, there was more care put into it, more thought, craftsmanship, like people had more pride in their work. And I wonder if that's kind of a result of this sort of, metric-based, result-based type of incentives and treating employees like commodities, where people kind of no longer have that,
I think
that pride in their work.
It's definitely a working theory.
Okay.
Well, don't you think it kind of includes too the need for profit to turn over these buildings, and because you have to make room for the next one and the next one, and you want to get the next contract. So if you can get this building, 20 days earlier by cutting out design, then you're going to be able to do the next contract and the next.
But I think it's like a short-term gain type of thing though, because you build these cheap, horrible buildings, and like I was reading some article, I can't remember where it was from, but like back in the day, when in the 20s and 30s, like people who built brick buildings were true masons, like they were craftsmen, and they were showing how like the bricks were laid just right. So now, thanks for coming back, guys. We're going to talk real quick here about giving and receiving feedback and just some different ways of looking at that. So,
Yeah.
sure.
So for starters, I'm going to plug at Heartland Developer Conference coming up in early September. I'm going to be giving a workshop, a 4-hour workshop on giving and receiving feedback, and we'll be using Legos, so it'll be fun and cool.
Nice.
But I started getting into this because it was an interesting avenue for me, because it's hard for me to receive feedback in a lot of ways, partially because I have generalized anxiety disorder. So feedback can often just like spike my anxiety like crazy. So it was kind of a question of, okay, how can I do that? How can I, engage this? And I started learning about it, and about especially the ways that your brain kind of is designed to not take feedback. So first off, there are 3 kinds of feedback. Well, you can probably get more if you want it, but there are 3 main. There's appreciation, which is, hey, you did a really good job on that, thanks. That's being appreciative of somebody. There is coaching, which is, I think you could do that this way and it would work a lot better, right? Maybe, try throwing your weight into a punch. Like, that's coaching. And then the third one is evaluation. And that's more, you got an A on this test. You got 3.9 is your employee satisfaction score, performance score, or whatever. The concrete, measurable pieces of feedback we get. That's the evaluation stuff. And it doesn't come with any attached, like, it's just a flat-out judgment that arrives. So, the thing is that your brain doesn't like feedback, because, people should go read the Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is a book that talks about, you have 2 kind of brain systems. You have a slow one, which is our conscious thinking mind, like we think through stuff, and then we have a fast one. And the reason the fast one exists is that the slow one takes a lot of sugar. Like, that's what your brain uses for fuel, right? So the fast one exists because if you're out on the savannah chasing, deer, gazelle, whatever, to death, or trying to run from lions, it turns out that close enough is great most of the time. Like, if you don't have to go and do hard thinking, then that's better. So this part of your brain is why it's really hard to type your password slowly or on a different keyboard than you're used to, because that kind of stuff filters into this fast system eventually. Your brain, things that you do a lot, your brain just goes, oh, it kind of composites them into one thing and chunks it into this fast system. Like, if you don't believe me, try typing half your password. The fast system then exists because it is good enough, but the fast system causes a lot of problems, especially when you take it out of the savannah and drop it into a Wall Street trading floor. That's where we get all of these cognitive biases that kind of come along with, like the sunk cost fallacy, all of these things you see humans doing that aren't necessarily logical or rational. The context of that is that you have triggers that show up when you start getting feedback. And the main one is the truth trigger. Like that's the one, if the audience is taking anything out of this, that's the one they should look for, because your brain has this thing it does where it's like, it just looks for something wrong, anything wrong that it can find. And that can find something wrong with like you, like, oh, you don't have the experience to be giving me feedback. Or it can find something wrong with the way you're saying it. Like, well, he said that, like he's a jerk, I don't have to take his feedback. Like, so, and it'll just find one wrong thing and it's like, yes. And it just grabs the feedback and throws it out. It doesn't like, it's all gone. Yes, I don't have to think about that. And it's great because it just saves you a bunch of sugar, except now you completely ignored anything else that was meaningful inside of that feedback.
Right.
So the truth triggers, the way you look at that is you have to become a little bit dispassionate about it. Like, okay, for instance, if it's somebody that you don't trust their motives or their experience, you go, well, is their inexperience actually valuable? Because sometimes somebody that doesn't know a lot of things can come in and, that's where disruption comes from a lot of times. Somebody comes from another industry and doesn't know a lot about this one, and they merge some idea with a new thing here that other people had just said that can't be done. Bam, you get Ubered, right? Mm-hmm. So, above and beyond that, you can ignore like, well, maybe if that part's wrong, is there anything else in here I can use? Kind of assume that the person has good meaning, good intent, and say, okay, is there anything I can grab out of this feedback that is useful? And if it isn't useful now, like right now, maybe it's useful later. And then on top of that, you can go, okay, well, maybe this feedback isn't, maybe I'm not sure about it. It's not like you have to immediately switch. Like you don't have to do it once and then you can never change it back. You can always try and do these tiny little experiments with it and go, okay, let's try it a couple of times this way and see how it goes. Next, there is relationship triggers. And you ever had, I don't know if you guys have significant others, you ever had a thing where you tell them something a whole bunch of different times and then they hear it from a stranger and they come home and tell you like, oh man, somebody told me this. Yeah. Like, I've said that literally 50 times to you.
Right.
It's because they don't necessarily hear you when you give feedback like that. What happens is their brain almost immediately leaps, because they have this relationship with you, to why are they saying it? Not what did they just say? It's like the brain goes, and then if feedback's worthless, I'm gonna like, what is their motives for criticizing me here?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so what can happen is you get this thing called switch tracking, and you see it all the time in sitcoms. You see it in sitcoms because it's funny, because it happens in real life. The canonical example they use is this guy gives his wife flowers, roses, and she doesn't like roses. And she's like, well, I told you before I don't like roses. And he says, okay, but you could say thanks for the flowers. And she's like, I don't feel like I have to say thanks for the flowers that I don't really want. And he says, well, I don't feel like you're being gratitude. And she's like, I don't feel like you're listening to me. And they're literally having two different conversations. They have jumped onto, like, as soon as she responded, he went off on a different track. Because she offered him feedback, and she's still on this first track. He's over here somewhere. Mm-hmm. They're having two different conversations at each other, but they still think they're having the same one. And the only thing you can do in that trick, or in that situation rather, is kind of just like, well, hold on, deep breath. Like, we're literally having two conversations. I think that you don't listen to me enough, and you think that I'm not appreciative enough of you. Both of these are really important things that we want to talk about. But we got to talk about one at a time. So which are we going to talk about first? And then we'll talk about the other one. So in that, you kind of see this thing that I got a lot of it. Actually, I've had the book with me because I grabbed it out of my car for no reason. Thanks for the feedback. This is a really good book. They call it process moves. And it's this thing where you talk like Data from The Next Generation, or like Spock. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, I mean, it is that kind of thing where you're diagnosing or describing, here's exactly where we're at, in the most overbroad, explicit way possible, that is devoid of emotion as much as you can. We're doing this thing, like at this point, like you believe this, I believe this, You believe that the only way for we're in an impasse, and you believe the only way past this impasse is for me to change completely. I don't think that's fair. What other options are there? Like, nobody talks like that, right? But it's useful because when you do talk like that, the other person, nobody talks to them like that. So when you do that, they actually listen to you with their conscious, rational mind. And it's a way of describing and proposing, describe where you're at. You have to diagnose that you're in one of these things. Describe what's happening to the other person, and then propose what you do next.
How much is this affected by our natural power struggle? Like just wanting to feel like you're, like say for example, if it was Tom, and maybe feeling if I was just as valid or more valid than him, and taking his feedback and altering what mine would give him more power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of that too. I mean, and you see that with bike shedding, right? Which I don't know if you're familiar with the term.
No.
Okay, real quick. It was a Parkinson's law of triviality, which is that the triviality of a task is inversely proportional to the time it takes to discuss it. Like, it was literally from him looking at this meeting, like being in a meeting where they were discussing building a nuclear reactor. And they were like, okay, we're gonna build this nuclear reactor. And it took like 10 minutes to get an okay. Then they were like, okay, we're gonna build a bike shed for the employees. And it took like half an hour to 45 minutes to argue. Then they were like, okay, the next time this committee meets, we wanna have coffee service. So they debated the coffee service, and it took literally, like, they didn't finish. They got to the end of the session, like, we're still arguing about this, so we'll postpone it for next week, and we'll come back with this list of costs. It's like, guys, it's like 25 pounds, I think it was pounds, because he's in England. But it was like, really? This is not, you've literally wasted more time in money worth than this was worth, just not do it.
Right.
So
I was on a project once, and we called it the $1 Million Blue Dot. We were literally at a conference call, and they were debating. There was a dot that denoted something was required, and there was debate on whether it was blue, gray, or like a gray trophy.
oh my God.
And they had like 100 contractors on the phone sitting there talking about it. Like we were joking, and it may not have been that far off. Like you literally spent $1 million deciding that this dot was blue. And the conversation like would start and go on for like a half hour, and like no conclusion would get made, and then it'd get picked up like the next week. It happened like 3 or 4 times before they kind of came to.
That's exactly it. And some of that is because those people do I feel like I can comment on this. I feel like I want to prove my worth in this situation.
Right, and I'm not gonna let it go.
Right. So, yeah, that's part of that too. And then the third one is identity triggers. And identity triggers are the ones that kind of hit home. Like when someone tells you you're a bad parent. Like,
wow.
Like that just like, like that kind of hits you right where it like hurts. And those kind of slip through, like, especially if you do have anxiety or other mental disorders or something that makes you more susceptible to that sort of thing. It gets really tough because sometimes those things will just worm right through and hit you. Where your boss is like, make sure you're on your game before this meeting today. You're just like, really? Like, was I not on my game before?
Right.
Am I not on my game now?
Right.
How do I get on my game? Like,
right.
So little things like that can just derail you mentally, and suddenly you're in this entirely different zone where you're just consumed with that the comment. And again, in this case, you are thinking about the feedback, but you're not thinking about it in any kind of realistic sense, in any kind of perspective. And perspective and thinking about it in terms of your natural wiring to feedback is important, because a lot of people respond, it depends. Some people respond to positive feedback, and they just get a boost and they feel great all day. Some people respond to positive feedback with, okay, and then they just get back to what they're doing, right? On the other hand, some people respond to negative feedback like that. Like, okay, well, I'll do that better next time. And then some people respond to negative feedback with, oh my God, everything's lost, right? Like, I don't do anything well. And that's about personal wiring and about how you process that. And you have to understand what your kind of internal roller coaster is going to be like when you get that feedback. So well, this is coming, so I need to not take this out of proportion and not make decisions on that stuff coming up.